The moment Princess Anne walked into that room, something was different. Those who'd spent years watching the royal family, studying the micro-expressions, the seating arrangements, the carefully choreographed distances between people, noticed it immediately. Anne wasn't standing where she usually stood. She wasn't positioned the way she usually positioned herself. And most tellingly, she wasn't looking in the direction she usually looked. For anyone who didn't understand the silent language of royal body politics, it probably meant nothing. But for those who did, it meant everything. Because the person Anne was, quietly, almost imperceptibly moving away from, was Camilla. And the person she seemed to be gravitating toward, carefully, cautiously, in the way that only someone who has thought very hard about something does, was William. Something had shifted, and once you saw it, you couldn't unsee it. To understand why this matters, you have to understand what Princess Anne's loyalty has historically meant inside the royal family. Anne is not someone who changes allegiances lightly. She is not someone who pivots for optics, or shifts her position because a situation became politically convenient. If anything, Anne has spent most of her public life doing the exact opposite. She has stayed loyal to causes, to people, to positions long after it would have been easier to quietly let them go. That stubbornness, and Anne herself would probably use that word, has been both her greatest strength and, at times, her greatest limitation. It is what made her such a formidable presence in royal circles. Because when Anne was on your side, she stayed there, and when Anne moved, people paid attention. So the question that palace watchers began circling around wasn't just that something had changed. The question was, why? Why now? Why Anne? And why would the shift involve William on one side and Camilla on the other? Those aren't random names in a random dispute. Those are two of the most significant figures in the future of the British monarchy. And Anne, the woman who had operated with remarkable consistency for decades, appeared to be making a choice between them. To understand where Anne stands now, you have to understand where she stood before. And that means going back to the years when Camilla was still in the process of becoming accepted, not just by the public, but by the family itself. It was never a secret that the road to acceptance for Camilla Parker Bowles was not an easy one. The history is well documented, the complications are well known, and the emotional weight of everything surrounding Charles and Camilla's relationship before their eventual marriage was something the entire royal family had to navigate. But not everyone navigated it the same way, and Anne's navigation was, characteristically, her own. Reports at the time suggested that Anne was not among those who made Camilla's integration into royal life particularly difficult. She was not part of any quiet opposition. And that, in a family where opposition to Camilla had at various points come from multiple directions, was itself significant. Anne appeared to extend a kind of working respect to Camilla. Not warmth in the obvious, theatrical sense. Anne rarely operates in that register with anyone, but something more durable. A practical acknowledgement, an acceptance that Camilla was part of the picture now, that she made Charles steadier, and that the stability of Charles mattered to the institution they all served. Palace watchers noted over the years that Anne and Camilla appeared to operate alongside each other without visible friction. There were shared engagements, shared appearances, and the kind of easy coexistence that, in a royal context, represents something genuinely meaningful. Because the alternative, the tension, the cold shoulders, the loaded silences that cameras sometimes catch, even when no one intends them to, would have been noticed instantly. And it wasn't there. When Charles became king and Camilla became queen, that relationship appeared to hold. Anne was one of the most active working royals, one of the most experienced in the room, and one of the few who had genuinely earned the respect of people across all the different factions and eras the modern monarchy had moved through. She and Camilla, in that early period of the new reign, seemed like a natural allied presence. Experienced, senior, practically minded, focused on the work. Two women who had both learned, in their own very different ways, how to operate effectively inside an institution that had not always made things easy for the women inside it. So when things began to change, when the subtle shift started appearing, the contrast was sharp precisely because the baseline had seemed so stable. The shift didn't arrive with any announcement. It never does with Anne. It arrived in the accumulated weight of small things. Things that individually might mean nothing, but together began to tell a story that people who paid close attention couldn't quite ignore. The first thing people started noticing was something almost impossible to pin down with certainty, which is exactly what made it so interesting. It was a change in positioning. Not dramatic, not theatrical, not the kind of thing you could point to in a single photograph and say definitively, "There, that's the moment." But across a series of public appearances and engagements, royal commentators and close observers began to note that Anne's proximity to Camilla had changed in ways that were difficult to explain as purely coincidental. The royal family's public appearances are not spontaneous. The placements, the walking orders, the groupings, all of it is managed, considered, and in many cases agreed upon in advance. So when patterns within those placements begin to shift, the question of why becomes genuinely interesting. Anne wasn't doing anything obvious. She wasn't turning her back, she wasn't publicly snubbing anyone, she wasn't generating the kind of headline moment that feeds a news cycle. She was doing something far more Anne. She was simply, quietly, repositioning. Those who speculated about the meaning of these small changes pointed to a few different possibilities. One interpretation was that this was purely logistical, that as the shape of the working monarchy shifted under the new reign, the organic groupings of people naturally changed too. This was the charitable, cautious reading. But there was another reading, one that took seriously the idea that Anne, who is not a person who does things accidentally, was signaling something. And what she appeared to be signaling was a subtle but meaningful distance from the Queen's orbit. Not hostility, not opposition in any crude sense, but a kind of independence. A quiet assertion that Anne's position in the institution was her own, and that it did not automatically orbit around Camilla in the way that some might have assumed it would. The second thing that people noticed was even harder to quantify, but in some ways more telling. It was about whose conversations Anne seemed to be investing in. And again, this is territory where certainty is impossible. No one is recording Anne's private conversations or tracking her phone calls. But royal life is, by its nature, largely a public performance, and the visible parts of that performance began to show Anne engaging more consistently and more warmly with William than observers had perhaps expected. William and Anne have always had a relationship. The Duke of Cambridge, now Prince of Wales, grew up watching Anne operate with the kind of unflappable professionalism that the institution demanded, and by all accounts he respected her for it. Anne, for her part, had always spoken about the importance of preparing the next generation properly. But in the past, that shared seriousness had expressed itself mostly at a distance, respectfully, without the kind of active, visible alignment that observers began to sense was developing. The engagement changed. The warmth became more visible. The moments when Anne and William were seen in conversation, real conversation, not the choreographed brief exchange of people fulfilling an obligation, seemed to carry a different quality. More substantive, more intentional, and palace watchers, looking for context to explain what they were seeing, began to reach for a more complicated explanation than mere coincidence or natural affection. Something had shifted in what Anne valued. Something had shifted in what she was concerned about. And whatever that something was, it appeared to be drawing her not toward Camilla's orbit, but toward William's. Now, it's worth pausing to address the obvious question. Why does this alignment actually matter? The royal family has always had internal dynamics, shifting loyalties, generational tensions. Is this anything more than the normal, inevitable friction of a large family navigating enormous institutional pressure? The answer is that it matters quite a lot. Anne is not a ceremonial figure in any meaningful sense. She is one of the hardest-working members of the royal family, someone whose opinion and endorsement carry genuine weight both inside the institution and in the public perception of it. When Anne backs something, or someone, that backing means something. It carries a credibility that is not easily manufactured. So if Anne is moving toward William, and away from Camilla's sphere of influence, the practical implications of that movement extend far beyond the interpersonal. It means that a figure with enormous institutional credibility is appearing to cast her lot, however quietly, with the next generation rather than with the current queen's inner circle. And it means that Camilla, who has worked for years to consolidate her position within the family, may be facing something she didn't expect, not open opposition, but the quiet withdrawal of a crucial ally. To understand the weight of what was beginning to develop, you need to understand the particular pressures building inside the royal family during this period. The monarchy was navigating a set of challenges unlike anything it had faced in the modern era. The loss of the Queen had removed the single most stabilizing force the institution had ever known. Charles's health had introduced a timeline that no one could ignore. The transition to a new reign had raised real and pressing questions about what the monarchy was going to look like going forward. The ongoing absence of Harry and Meghan cast a long shadow that showed no real signs of lifting. And within all of that, there was a quieter, more persistent tension about something that doesn't make headlines as easily as a royal feud, but matters just as deeply. The question of institutional direction. What should the monarchy prioritize? How should it spend its political and social capital? Which traditions should it protect, and which ones needed to evolve? These are not abstract questions. They get answered differently depending on who has influence, who is listened to, and who is trusted to read the room correctly. And they are questions on which Anne and Camilla, it was beginning to appear, may not have been entirely aligned. The signs that Anne was quietly stepping back from automatic solidarity with Camilla came in waves, and they came in forms consistent with how Anne operates. No speeches, no interviews, no carefully placed comments to favored journalists. Instead, the signals came through action and proximity, through where Anne was, and who she was near, and what she appeared to be engaged with. One area where observers began to pay close attention was the question of working royal duties. Specifically, who was expected to carry them, and how the distribution of those duties was evolving under the new reign. This is a question that touches on something fundamental about the future of the monarchy. Because a smaller working royal family means that each member who does carry out public duties becomes proportionally more significant. Anne has always been intensely committed to the working side of the monarchy. It is, if anything, her primary identity within it. She works at a pace that has impressed observers for decades. So when questions arose about the future shape of working royal life, questions that touched on support for those who carry the load, recognition of what that load involves, and the strategic thinking behind how the institution presents itself, Anne had very strong views. And those views, reports suggested, were not always in perfect harmony with the direction that the Queen's household appeared to be pushing. Where Camilla's influence seemed to operate in one register, focused on the consolidation of her own position, on the cultural dimensions of queenship, on the careful management of her own legacy, Anne's priorities remained stubbornly practical. She cared about the work. She cared about whether the institution was being run efficiently, whether the right decisions were being made about what the public needed from the royal family, and whether the next generation was being properly supported. And that last part, the question of supporting the next generation, was where William's name kept appearing, because William was facing a transition that was, in some ways, unprecedented. As Prince of Wales, in a period where the king was managing serious health concerns, and the institution was navigating significant pressure from multiple directions, William was carrying more than any Prince of Wales in recent memory had been asked to carry. He was doing it without his brother beside him. He was doing it with Catherine recovering from her own serious health situation. He was doing it in a media environment more aggressive than anything that had preceded it. And he was doing it, observers noted, with a level of steadiness that was quietly impressing people who'd wondered whether he had that quality. Anne, watching this from close quarters, appeared to see something she recognized. She saw someone doing the unglamorous, relentless, practically minded work that she had always believed the institution required. She saw someone who wasn't playing to the gallery, wasn't managing a personal brand, wasn't running a parallel operation designed to build their own profile at the expense of the institution's needs. She saw someone who reminded her of how she herself had always understood the job. Whether or not this is precisely what Anne was thinking, and no one on the outside can know for certain, the visible result was the same. Anne's alignment with William began to strengthen at exactly the point where the pressures on him were greatest. And Camilla, who had her own very particular relationship with William and her own understanding of the power dynamics within the new reign, could not have failed to notice. The relationship between Camilla and William has always been one of the most carefully observed and carefully managed within the royal family. On the surface, it appeared cordial. There were no obvious public ruptures, no moments where tension broke through in ways that generated headlines. Both parties clearly understood the importance of maintaining the appearance of a functional working relationship. The institution required it, Charles needed it, and neither Camilla nor William would benefit from visible conflict, so the surface remained smooth. But underneath the surface, there were currents that observers had long speculated about. William's feelings about Camilla, about her role in the breakdown of his parents' marriage, about her integration into his family, about what her presence meant for his mother's memory, were never entirely resolvable through the logic of institutional necessity. He had managed those feelings, compartmentalized them, operated with a professionalism that reflected his understanding of what was required. But compartmentalizing something is not the same as resolving it. And in a family where history is long and memory is long, the managed surface can only do so much. When reports emerged, cautiously, through the channels that royal correspondents rely on when sources want something known without being officially stated, that William had concerns about aspects of how the new reign was being managed, observers paid close attention. The concerns were framed carefully. They weren't about Camilla personally, or not only personally. They were about institutional direction, about communication, about whether the approach being taken by the senior household was the right approach for a monarchy navigating genuinely unprecedented challenges. But the source of at least some of those concerns, it was suggested, connected to decisions and influences that traced back to the Queen's household. And Camilla's household was not simply a domestic arrangement, it was an institutional one. The people around Camilla, the advisors who shaped her agenda, the courtiers who managed her relationships and her public profile, these were people with views, with priorities, with particular ideas about how the institution should operate. And those ideas didn't always align with William's. So when Anne began showing visible signs of proximity to William, when she began appearing to invest her credibility and presence in his direction rather than the Queen's, the question of what she was actually responding to became urgent. Was this personal? Was it institutional? Was it about a specific disagreement, or a broader unease? And perhaps most importantly, how much did Camilla already know? The answer, based on what observers could piece together from public signals, appeared to be, she knew something was different. Whether she knew the full extent of what was shifting was harder to say. But Camilla is not someone who arrived at her position by failing to read rooms. She had spent decades developing an exquisitely calibrated understanding of the dynamics around her. She had survived situations that would have broken people with less patience or less intelligence. And she had done it largely by being attentive to exactly the kinds of quiet signals that Anne was now sending. The indications that Camilla had registered the shift came in the characteristic form that royal communication takes when something is being acknowledged without being spoken directly. There were subtle adjustments in how the Queen's engagements were framed in relation to other royal activities. There were moments in shared public settings where the old, easy coexistence between Anne and Camilla seemed to carry a slightly different quality, not hostile, not collapsed, but watchful, as though both women were being careful in ways they hadn't previously needed to be. Those who observed Camilla closely during this period noted what one royal commentator described as a heightened attentiveness to the field. She appeared to be gathering information, or at least processing it, paying closer attention to where Anne was placing herself and who she was engaging with. And the more she paid attention, the more she would have been seeing what everyone else was seeing, that Anne's center of gravity was shifting. For Camilla, this presented a particular kind of challenge, because the relationship with Anne was not one she could easily address through the normal mechanisms of royal management. She couldn't call a meeting with Anne and lay out her concerns, because Anne would not respond well to that kind of maneuver, and the attempt itself would signal a vulnerability that Camilla had no interest in signaling. She couldn't publicly counter the narrative, because the narrative was based on nothing that could be directly denied. No one had said anything. No one had announced anything. Everything was operating in the register of implication and proximity. And she couldn't simply ignore it, because ignoring a significant shift in the alignment of an influential senior royal is not a strategy, it's a hope. So what she appeared to do was recalibrate. She turned her attention to understanding the shape of what was developing. Not necessarily to stop it, but to understand it well enough to navigate around it, to find her own stable ground in a landscape that was quietly rearranging itself. But here's what made the situation genuinely complicated for Camilla. If what Anne and William were aligned on was something institutional, something about the future of the monarchy, about how it should be run, about what it should prioritize, then the question wasn't just about interpersonal dynamics. The question was about who was right, and that was a much harder ground on which to compete. Because Anne, with her decades of experience and her unimpeachable record of service, and William, with his position as heir and his demonstrated seriousness about what that position required, represented a particular kind of authority. Not the authority of position. Camilla obviously outranked both of them in formal terms as queen, but the authority of credibility, of having earned, through consistent and demonstrable effort, the right to be taken seriously on questions about what the institution needed. What was the alliance actually about? What had drawn Anne to William's side in a way that was visible enough to be noticed, significant enough to concern Camilla, and important enough to warrant the careful, quiet construction that both Anne and William appeared to be engaged in? The answer, when it began to come into focus, was both simpler and more consequential than the interpersonal drama might suggest. It was about the future. Specifically, it was about how the institution was positioning itself for a future that was now closer than it had ever been. Closer, because Charles's health had introduced a timeline that no one could ignore. Closer, because William was already functioning somewhere between Prince of Wales and Shadow King. And closer, because the decisions being made right now about institutional direction were not theoretical. They were being made, and they would have consequences. Anne and William, palace watchers began to suggest, had found common ground on a set of views about what those decisions should look like. And those views, in key respects, differed from the direction that Camilla's household appeared to be pushing. The first area of alignment was about the monarchy's relationship to the public. This is a question that sounds abstract until you understand what's actually at stake. The monarchy in the modern era depends on what might be called active legitimacy. Not just the passive assumption that the institution exists and continues, but a live, renewable sense that it serves a purpose and that the people within it are earning their position. This was something the late Queen had understood instinctively and had expressed through 7 decades of patient, visible, quietly remarkable service. And it was something that Anne, whose model of royal life was built directly on that understanding, felt deeply. William had come to his own version of the same conviction through a different route, through watching his institution struggle, through the Harry and Meghan crisis, through the public's shifting relationship with the royal family after the Queen's death, through his own hard thinking about what it would mean to be king in a country and a world that had changed dramatically. He had concluded, observers suggested, that the monarchy's survival depended on demonstrating its relevance not through grand gestures or celebrity-style visibility, but through genuine work, genuine connection, and genuine accountability to the public it served. This was not a view that was universally reflected in how the current household was being managed. Camilla's approach to queenship, thoughtful, culturally sophisticated, carefully managed in terms of legacy and image, was not the same approach. It was not without merit, but it operated on a different frequency from what Anne and William were converging on. The second area of alignment was more specific and more politically charged. It was about reform, about what needed to change in how the institution operated, how it communicated, and how it related to its own future. This was territory that William had been circling for years, ever since the Sussex crisis had made clear that the existing structures were not adequate to the pressures the institution was facing. He had views about communication strategy, about the courtier culture, about the relationship between the various royal households, and how they could, or couldn't, function coherently. Those views had not always been welcomed. Anne brought to this conversation something that William, for all his seriousness, couldn't supply himself: institutional memory. She had been watching this family and this institution operate across 5 decades. She had seen what worked and what didn't, which reforms had actually improved things and which had simply rearranged the deck chairs. And she had developed, through all of that watching and working, a set of views about the direction the institution needed to go that were, in key respects, consistent with what William was pushing toward. Not identical. Anne and William are different people with different styles, but compatible, aligned in their underlying logic. The third area was perhaps the most sensitive, and it most directly implicated Camilla. It was the question of institutional weight, of who within the royal family was actually doing the work that needed to be done, and whether the role of queen consort was being understood in its historically established terms. The role has traditionally been understood as a supporting one that amplifies the work of the institution without seeking to redirect it. When that understanding appeared, to some observers, to be under pressure, when the Queen's household seemed to operate with a degree of independent agency that generated friction with other parts of the family, it created exactly the kind of quiet institutional tension that Anne, with her acute sensitivity to how the family operated, would find troubling. And so the alliance, if that's the right word for something so carefully unspoken, began to make sense. Not as a confrontation with Camilla, not as an organized opposition or a palace coup, but as something much more characteristic of how Anne actually operates. A quiet, durable, practically motivated alignment with the people and the priorities she believed were right. An investment in William, not as a political choice, but as a judgment about who was thinking about the institution correctly and who was going to need credible, experienced support to carry that thinking forward. And Camilla, registering all of this, found herself navigating something she hadn't fully anticipated. She had worked for decades to build her position within the family and within the institution. She had earned, through patience and professionalism and genuine commitment, a place that no one could simply take from her. But the thing she found herself facing now wasn't someone trying to take her place. It was something quieter and harder to address. A realignment of gravity. A shift in where the institutional credibility was flowing. And that shift had at its center a woman who had never, in all the years Camilla had known her, been particularly interested in playing games. Anne didn't do politics for its own sake. She did what she believed in. The consequences of this quiet realignment began to manifest in ways that were visible to those paying attention. The first was a shift in the dynamics of senior royal coordination, the behind-the-scenes process by which working members of the family align their messaging and manage the complex logistics of representing the institution. The consultations Anne engaged in, the discussions she participated in, the informal alignments that shape how the institution functions day to day, all of it was adjusting. And the adjustment pointed consistently toward William. For William, this had a very practical effect. He was already carrying an enormous load in circumstances that were unprecedented and underappreciated. Having Anne's visible credibility behind him changed the calculations around him. It made certain conversations easier. It made certain positions more defensible. It gave him a kind of endorsement that wasn't manufactured but earned. Because Anne's credibility is not something that can be borrowed. It is extended only when she genuinely believes it's merited. For Camilla, the practical effect was a shift in the balance of informal influence within the family. She retained all her formal authority. That wasn't in question. But formal authority and informal influence are not the same thing. In a family as complex as this one, informal influence is often where real decisions happen, whose views carry weight in the conversations that aren't official, whose positioning shapes the atmosphere of family gatherings, whose opinion is sought when something genuinely difficult needs navigating. These questions don't have formal answers. They have political ones, and the politics were shifting. The people around Camilla, her advisors, her household staff, the courtiers who managed her agenda, were not blind to this. They were tracking exactly these kinds of shifts. And what they were tracking was a scenario in which one of the most credible and experienced members of the royal family was quietly but clearly repositioning herself in relation to the Queen. Not against the Queen, but in a way that created a new and visible center of gravity that wasn't Camilla. The challenge for Camilla's team was that there was no obvious countermove. You cannot publicly criticize Princess Anne, one of the most respected members of the royal family, for privately holding views she hasn't publicly stated. You cannot reverse a quiet realignment by forcing it into the open, because forcing things into the open creates the very public conflict that everyone, most of all Anne and William, had carefully avoided. You cannot simply redirect Anne's loyalty, because Anne's loyalty has never been redirectable by external pressure. The only things that have ever moved Anne are her own convictions, and right now, her convictions appeared to be pointing in a particular direction. What Camilla could do was double down on the things that secured her own position. Her relationship with Charles remained, by all appearances, solid. Her public presence, her cultural engagements, her very considerable personal charm continued to operate effectively. And there was a practical logic to simply continuing to do what she did well, and trusting that the institution was large enough to contain multiple centers of gravity without collapsing. But the question of what happened next, whether the quiet alignment between Anne and William would remain quiet, or whether events would force it into the open, remained unresolved. And the events gathering on the horizon suggested that resolution of some kind was probably coming. Because the situation the royal family was navigating was not static. Charles's health had introduced a variable that no amount of institutional management could entirely account for. The public scrutiny on William as heir was intensifying by the month. The Harry situation continued to produce periodic eruptions that required responses. And the question of what a modern monarchy looked like, what it was for, who it served, how it communicated its relevance, was not going to wait for the internal dynamics of the family to resolve themselves on their own timeline. For Anne, the decision to quietly position herself alongside William was not a dramatic break with the past. It was, in a sense, the most characteristic thing she could have done. Anne has always operated according to a clear internal logic. Do what the institution needs, back the people who are doing the work, and trust that the long term will vindicate the choices made for the right reasons. She had applied that logic to her own career for 50 years. She was applying it now. What made this moment different was the stakes. The choices being made right now, about institutional direction, about who was listened to, about how the monarchy was positioning itself for the next chapter, were not routine. They were foundational. And Anne, who understood foundations better than almost anyone, appeared to have decided that the most important thing she could do was make sure the right foundations were being laid. The most significant thing about Anne's repositioning was not what it revealed about the past, but what it suggested about the future. It suggested a future in which William would not be navigating the transition to kingship alone, or at the mercy of existing household structures that had shaped the early years of his father's reign. It suggested a future in which he would have, at his back, one of the most experienced and most credible figures the institution had produced in the modern era. The consequences of that for Camilla's long-term position are genuinely uncertain. She is queen now, and that fact is not contingent on Anne's approval or William's goodwill. Her place in history is already secured in ways that wouldn't change regardless of how the internal dynamics evolved. But the question of what kind of queen she would be remembered as, what her influence actually shaped, what the institution looked like when her era was over, that question is very much still being written. And the alignment taking shape between Anne and William suggested that some of those chapters were going to be written by people with a particular vision, and who had decided to work toward it together. For those watching from outside, the story of what appeared to be happening between Anne, William, and Camilla offers a window into something the royal family rarely allows to be visible: the actual political mechanics of how an ancient institution manages its own future. The formal structures are clear: the titles, the lines of succession, the constitutional roles. But the informal structures, the relationships, the alliances, the quiet positioning that actually shapes how decisions get made, are almost never visible. When they become visible, even partially and indirectly, they tell us something genuinely important about the health of the institution and the direction it's heading. What they appeared to be telling us was that the transition to William's eventual reign was not going to be a smooth handover along existing lines. It was going to be shaped by a realignment already underway, a quiet, careful, characteristically non-theatrical repositioning of people and priorities that would determine what kind of monarchy he inherited and what kind he would be able to build. Anne's role in that realignment was not the most visible, but it may have been the most consequential. Because what Anne brought to William's side was not just personal support or family solidarity. She brought something rarer and more durable. The credibility of someone who has spent half a century proving that she puts the institution above everything else. When someone with that record quietly but visibly invests in a particular direction, it sends a signal that is very difficult to argue with. Not because it's politically powerful, but because it's earned. And that might be the most important thing to understand about what appeared to be happening. This wasn't a drama about family feuds or personal grievances. It was something more serious, and in some ways more hopeful. An experienced, unsentimental, practically minded royal elder appearing to judge that the person best positioned to carry the institution forward was earning that position through the right means, and deciding, in her characteristic way, to make that judgment visible. Whether that would prove to be the right judgment, whether William would carry the institution forward in the way Anne appeared to believe he could, remained to be seen. The future of the British monarchy is not something that any individual can determine, however experienced or however well-positioned. It is shaped by events, by public sentiment, by choices made under pressure, by forces that aren't fully predictable from inside or outside. But the alignment between Anne and William, quietly visible to those paying attention, suggested that at least one person with an extraordinary amount of experience watching this institution navigate the unforeseeable had looked at the present situation and made a bet. She had looked at where things stood, at who was doing the work and who was building the foundations, and she had chosen her direction. Not with a speech, not with an announcement, not with the kind of gesture that feeds a news cycle, but with her presence, with her positioning, with herself. And in the language of royal politics, a language of implication and proximity, and carefully managed visibility. That is about as loud as it gets. So here's what we want to know. Do you think Anne's quiet alignment with William is a sign that she believes the monarchy is heading in the right direction? Or a sign that she's worried it isn't? Is this about supporting William's future? Or about protecting the institution from something she's genuinely concerned about? And what does it tell us about where Camilla really stands? Not formally, not constitutionally, but actually, in the balance of power that will shape the next chapter of the royal family. Because the answer to that question might determine everything about what this monarchy looks like in 10 years. Let us know what you think in the comments below.